Thank you very much, Dr. Conkle. It's a pleasure to continue this discussion. It's a nice-sized audience, which is encouraging to me. I think we made clear yesterday that this is the first such Congress of the IEA that has really taken this question of climate change and its current and particularly its future implications for patterns of health, disease and indeed physical survival around the world, taken it seriously. And I think we're beginning to see the outline of the agenda that presents itself to us as epidemiologists as we go into this 21st century, wishing to maintain, as in the past, our social relevance and usefulness of the work that we do. And there are critical needs in this area. Now, you'll probably have been able to deduce from the opening slide there, the tripolar word just refers to the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the Himalayas or the Himalayan region. The phrase, the third pole, is now in increasingly wide use as a recognition that many of the same sorts of issues will bear on societies, populations, families in that region as in parts of the Arctic. So I'll come to that in just a moment, but I was very interested in what Dick Jackson has been telling us about the ways in which the health of populations can be improved by bringing human ecology back in line with the essential biological and psychological needs and capabilities of the human animal, something that was shaped very strongly by variations in climatic conditions and environmental conditions over the 2 million years or so of evolution of the Homo genus. And there have been many species along the line. We're the only surviving one, Homo sapiens. Can we carry the lineage forward? Towards the end of his talk, Dick mentioned the word community a few times, and it was implicit in what he was saying earlier, but it was important to actually bring it out because it's not just about improving health-related behaviours in individuals or families. That's very important in its own right, but it's not the beginning and the end of achieving resilience in communities. And Dick, I think a useful way of thinking about the word resilience, rather a simple statement, is that it's an index or an indication of the capacity to absorb shocks. And that means that, of course, it also refers to issues of social cohesion, social capital, things that become very important in a number of the rural and remote communities around the world. That includes in Australia, our indigenous population, Australian Aboriginals, many of whose groups, communities, for the moment, are seriously lacking in social capital because of the cultural destruction that's gone on in the last 200 years. So I think the role of resilience in relation to climate change needs to be understood within that sort of frame. And I think it's a two-way street, isn't it? That if we're going to achieve a sustainable future society living within the limits of the planet, then yes, a key task for us is to avert further climate change to the extent possible. But in the other direction, the extent to which the community, the population, is physically and mentally healthy, the less susceptible they will be to the impacts of climate change and other large-scale environmental changes. And you mentioned the great problem of obesity, rising overweight and obesity. And maybe it's a trite observation, but the ratio of skin surface to body mass is a critical determinant of how well you can dissipate heat. And although I've not seen any good studies on it, it's very likely that in a future hotter world with more extreme heat waves, that those persons who are seriously overweight are going to suffer particularly. So, resilience is a critical issue for us in thinking about how prepared we are to deal with climate change as it unfolds, and how ready we are and fit and able and enthusiastic to get on with the job of averting it. Right, now that's a classic mistake for a speaker, to waste the first 5 minutes digressing. But there you are, I've done it. Now I'll go through the slides. Now there's no shame attached to your answer here. Who was not here for my Cruikshank lecture yesterday? Right, thank you. That justifies my showing this slide. Sorry for those who've seen it before, I'll just do it very quickly, but it's to make the point that climate change is not some simple exposure like cigarette smoking or asbestos exposure. It's a complex. You might think of it very approximately as a bit like the experience of poverty, disadvantage, many ramifications, many ways in which it will bear on human health. It's helpful to be able to think of three distinctive pathways, I think, and I'm going to show you those and not go into detail. But the first pathway is the one that we're very familiar with, and we see it in the newspapers. The direct impacts, mostly of a physical kind, but also on mental health, of extreme weather events, including heat waves. Secondly, we move on to that pathway where we're heading towards effects that are mediated now by changes in the natural systems around us that directly or indirectly we depend upon. So let's see the second branch here. This takes us down the pathway that focuses on disruptions or changes to biological and ecological processes that bear on food yields and the distribution and activity and seasonality of infectious diseases, and on the flows and quality of fresh water and so on. All of those as fundamental to sustained human health. And the more elusive third category is this one. And a lot of that actually is mediated by issues within the wider community to have to do with social relations, economic conditions, habitability of settlements, displacement, tensions over dwindling resources, perhaps across borders. You could imagine the many ways in which community resilience would be very important in that third pathway. Anyway, just bear that in mind. We're talking about a very complex set of causal influences. So now we'll look at the tripolarity of it all. Here are the approximate temperature increases over the last several decades. And notice again the very disparate changes as a function of latitude and indeed of hemisphere. Most of the land mass which absorbs more of the incoming solar heat. Most of the warming is in the northern hemisphere. You see the Arctic there up around 2 to 3 degrees centigrade warming. You see with the blue arrow the third pole around the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, and the downstream communities dependent on the river water flows. And then you see at the bottom the Antarctic, where in fact there's been a deal of cooling around the coastal waters for reasons that I mentioned yesterday. So they're three rather different settings. Now, apologies, you've all seen, or many of you have seen about 3 or 4 different maps of the Arctic, but there is something special about this one that you've not seen before. But notice first, again, the shrinkage of the sea ice. It was earlier on bounded by that red line, has now shrunk to the area shown in genuine white. But there are 2 other lines, the blue and the green, and those are the shipping lanes that are opening up now as the ice recedes. And that has many implications for things like the introduction of invasive species on the hulls of ships that will do damage to marine ecosystems and productivity and fish catches and so on. Also has implications for coastal pollution with its consequences for human health. So it's a part of the extended climate change story. Now, I feel a bit of an amateur presenting this one because we had such a good presentation this morning from Patricia Cochrane, and I think a number of you might have heard that. Patricia has a distinguished involvement in this area, and she's co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Global Network on Climate Change, and as an Alaskan gave us a very good account of the risks to health. This was a slide that I prepared just to give an overview of the several major categories of impacts, and again you can see a sampling of those 3 different pathways. Now, I'm not going to talk about these individually, and we've heard the details of some of them from other expert speakers earlier today. But just notice again the breadth of possibilities here. Here's one recent good review paper on the issues here in Alaska, and it has a very detailed section on the implications for human health. And I'm just going to, I have extracted from that paper a number of dot points. I'll just read through those. Thawing permafrost from the bottom of freshwater lake and ponds, affecting drinking water quality. Disruptions to water supplies in general and to sewage systems with risks of diarrheal infections and skin and respiratory infections. Infectious diseases in harvested food, and we heard this morning of the interesting case in the coastal waters around this region of Alaska of sufficient warmth to sustain the proliferation of the Vibrio parahemolyticus and cause diarrheal disease, gastroenteritis in consumers of shellfish. I think this was in 2003, 2004, after a number of years of unusually slightly warmer coastal temperatures. The northward movement of insects and vertebrate vectors of infectious diseases, so the documented drift of beavers northward as vectors for the giardiasis bug represents a threat to human health. And then there's the thawing of traditional and consequences for traditional ice cellars. That's CELLARS. A problem of food contamination leading in turn to the necessary purchasing of more store-bought processed foods. Winter sea ice loss, reducing habitat for walruses and seals, critical component of diet in northwest Alaska. Accelerating coastal erosion, leading to loss of critical basic infrastructure. And storms are a continuing and growing threat then to life and property. Ecological and hydrological changes due to permafrost degradation are changing habitats, migration patterns, and the distributions of species that are important for fishing and hunting. And the last one was the increased range and severity of wildfires with increased risks to life and property, the alteration of hunting opportunities, and expected increases in physical and mental health effects, particularly from wildfire smoke. So that's a good starting point if you're interested in reading further about this. And here's an example of the problem of coastal erosion around much of Alaska. As I recall, there was an assessment made by the US Army Corps of Engineers a few years ago that identified approximately 1,200 communities that were considered at risk from these effects of climate change, coastal erosion, the thawing of permafrost and so on. 26 of them were deemed to be at critical risk, and special programs were then proposed to try to stay the hand of disturbed nature. It's a tall order when you're trying to deal with the might of the seas and the fact that there's no longer sea ice around the coast to act as a physical buffer. Now here's the other end of the world, the Antarctic. Not a lot of humans living down there, but there are implications for human health. There's very substantial melting going on of the ungrounded sea ice around the coasts, and indeed of some of the glaciers, particularly in West Antarctica. And an obvious consequence of that is a very substantial contribution to sea level rise. Now, when climatologists or climate scientists were first interested in the implications of warming for sea level rise, most of the talk was about thermal expansion. But over the years, the contribution of melting ice has become increasingly important and now accounts for about half of the total sea level rise that's going on. And this is already a substantial source, and of course if the great grounded glaciers in the Antarctica continue their slow slippage towards the ocean, which is happening, one of the interesting newly discovered things is that often the warming first manifests underneath the glacier and lubricates it so that it's able to move a little more freely over the land surface. So sea level rise is there as a particular problem. In the meantime, some of the inhabitants are going to suffer, and there's a very interesting literature on the 4 or 5 major species of penguins in the Antarctic, Adelie, king, chinstrap, and so on. They're faring rather differently, interestingly. Interesting comparisons as to how these different species of birds are being affected by the warming and the melting. The seasonal change in heavy rainfall events, for example, which are wiping out high proportions of the newly born chicks, newly hatched, I should say, newly hatched chicks for one of the species, chinstrap, I think, but I'm not sure. But coming back to this question then of sea level rise, it has worldwide impacts on coastal habitability, coastal soils, salinity and food yields, freshwater salinity, and of course physical safety. Now around the fringe of the Antarctic, we're seeing depletion of the base of the marine food web with the reduction in populations of krill and algae. A number of the algae actually bloom on the undersurface of the sea ice, and as that sea ice disappears, so they do. And there may be a big surprise waiting in store for us. Remember, if you do go back 100 million years, today's South Pole, the Antarctica, was a very tropical place, palm trees everywhere. And a lot of that is now stored as fossil solar energy in the form of methane trapped under these vast and thick glaciers. And as they melt over time, there is the possibility of an enormous release, more than would come from the Siberian permafrost, of methane. And I think I don't need to tell the audience just how potent an effect on the warming of the climate that would result in. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, short-lived, but if you've got a huge geological belch of the stuff, that sort of volume, it's going to cause a spike in global temperatures. And then the third pole. And we're going to hear some more about this, I think, with our next speaker, this area. But inevitably, it's a problem again of warming and the melting of glaciers and the implications for river flows off the west and the east and the northern faces of the Himalayas, particularly off the Tibetan Plateau. Of course, there's a long history to this, as there is to most of the climate change story that's unfolding today. If we go back about 4,500 years, the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, now Pakistan, was beginning its flourishing period of about 7 centuries, and very dependent on the river flows coming off the western end of the Himalayas. And temperatures got warmer and flows accelerated and glaciers began to recede, but the snow was melting at the wrong time of year, melting too early, disrupting the agricultural system, and the Harappans were in crisis, a food production crisis. And that was the key factor, along with a shift in the monsoon system associated with the warming, which led to the collapse of that civilization around 3,700 years ago. So there are big things at stake here for the very many countries and civilizations, and these days very large populations dependent on the continued flow and stability of water supplies in that area. Now, I don't want to steal any thunder from our next speaker, but one of the interesting examples is in Cambodia, I understand, with the Mekong, where there's a remarkable hydrological system, the Tonle Sap Lake, which branches off the Mekong River, and depending on the season, when the river flow is full and vigorous, the lake fills, and then when the river flow seasonally recedes, the lake empty. So it's a natural self-flushing mechanism, but that lake is the source of a very high proportion of the freshwater fish that are consumed and eaten in Cambodia. And I think something of the order of 80 to 90% of all fish eaten in Cambodia are freshwater fish. So that's just one example of an ecological system that is a critical source of food for humans that would be disrupted by a change in the pattern of flow of the Mekong River. And then the Tibetan Plateau itself faces stresses. I'm not sure if I've got a picture of it here. Not a picture of it, but we're talking about the downstream societies around South Asia and Southeast Asia, but on the northern side, of course, is this vast Tibetan plateau, and things are beginning to change there too, with the thawing, the warming, the pastures, for example, changing their character. Some of them are becoming less productive. Again, a problem for traditional livestock herding, protein supply. I'm not going to talk about the rivers because we're going to hear a bit more about that, I think, in some detail, but again, I've just mentioned a couple of the key components there. And I've raised this awkward but realistic question that tensions are very likely to arise as a result of water shortages, failing agricultural systems in future. I was quite surprised in May of this year when the president of the World Bank made an unadorned statement that was quoted in the press saying, within 3 decades, I think I quote him exactly, within 3 decades, there will be wars over food and water shortages due to climate change. Now, the World Bank wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. They've got the message that this is actually a serious issue, and they can't proceed with orthodox Rostovian economic development that they've implicitly believed in, G'd up by the Chicago School of Economics for the last 3 or 4 decades. They're having to rethink the prospects and the risks to development because of climate change. Now, Chairman, I haven't actually memorised my full set of slides, so I'm not sure whether I'm about to show the end slide. We'll find out when I press the button.
It'll be a mystery.
Oh no, it's not. Sorry about that. But just to take one example, Nepal, of course, not so much dependent on the downstream flows of the rivers, but up there and exposed rather directly to these changes in the glaciological and general environmental conditions. And if you read through that, you can see some of the issues that are of concern to the Nepalese now, to do with food and water security, to do with the exacerbation of diarrheal disease, for example, if water flows and quality do change. The risks of various infectious diseases, these ones vector-borne, malaria and leishmaniasis, under warming conditions. And the fact that, as has been said many times, adaptation strategies go far beyond the health sector. We may be concerned about human health, but the response has to come from government at large. And hence that discussion that's now evolving in Nepal along those lines. So this is the final slide. Here we are, the patient, Earth, age, 4.6 billion years. I didn't put the primary symptom in, but of course it's fever. Diagnosis, tripolar disorder. Treatment, immediate, please. Thank you.